No, no, I have meeting
You are there, right? That means it's okay. Do you
Well, I'm going to be so it won't matter.
I know, I was moving this out of the way in case I knocked my bottle of water over. I didn't want to destroy all the computer equipment.
Welcome to THETA Round today. Our guest is Dr. Louise Rutgers. Louise Rutgers has a PhD in economics from Harvard. She's an English professor at the Institute of Math, Health, Technology, and Aging Research, and in the Department of Economics. Her research focuses on the methods and application of cost-effectiveness analysis. Before starting at Rutgers, she worked as a senior fellow at the which is a non-profit public policy organization that is based in Washington. Elected to the membership in the Institute of Medicine of the National Academy of Sciences in 1983, she has served on several IOM committees, including the National Cancer Policy Board, and the Committee on Valuing Community-Based Non-Clinical Prevention Policies and Wellness Studies. Most of you will know Dr. Rutgers through the U.S. Public Health Service Panel on Cost-Effectiveness in Health Medicine, which published recommendations for improving the quality and comparability of cost-effectiveness studies in a book. I expect at least 50% of you to have it right on your shelf next year, ready to consult with. And 3 articles in the Journal of the American Medical Association. So that was in 1996. But so there's going to be an update. So in 2011, she has been one of the group of 5 leaders in the field who are organizing and facilitating the second panel of cost-effectiveness in health and medicine. The 14 members of the second panel were appointed in the fall of 2012 and are working to bring the book and the recommendations up to date with the many advances in cost-effectiveness analysis. And I believe the book should be ready and coming out next year.
That's the schedule, I don't know when that's.
She's also the deputy editor of the Journal of Medical Decision Making, and fantastic feedback if you ever want. She has published many articles and 7 books, including Educated Guesses, Making Policy About Medical Screening Tests, and its Prevention Better Than Cure, and Technology in Hospitals, Medical Advances in Their Discussion. So we are very happy to welcome Dr. Rutgers today for our round, talking about making public decisions about health, cost effectiveness, and cost benefit. Welcome.
Thank you.
But before you're allowed to start, and there are so many people in the room today, so I still want to do the introduction. Just say who you are, where you're from, but super fast. So it's like a speech thing today. So So Viara Center, Scientist Public Health Ontario, and assistant professor at the Institute for Health Quality Management and Evaluation, IH. So everybody following from IHME can just say it. William.
William Wong from THETA.
Amy Thompson from Faculty Pharmacy.
I'm Cheng Wong, I'm doing masters here. Nicholas is a guy from THETA.
Julian Health Economics.
Richard Sir from Stick Kids. Eric Melbert from
Okay, who kind of this thing I just learned from Addis Ababa University.
You are Thai Camp from well, what are you from?
Thomas Ewing from Semiconductor Management.
Hi, I'm Jeffrey Hobson, the Director of the Pharmacoeconomics Research Unit at Cancer Care Ontario.
And the Florida.
Miriam and
Your name and grade. Oh, I'm Mariana Gutierrez, and I'm with Master.
Hi there, I'm Jeremy Blueball. I'm not sure.
Yeah, everybody, and without any photo dealing.
Thank you all for coming. I'm going to start by putting what I will talk about in context, cost effectiveness and cost benefit analysis. I'm grateful to the 2009 Nobel Prize Committee for choosing Elinor Osterman, therefore acquainting me with her work because I hadn't known about it earlier. She works with how people make decisions, how they create decision-making structures for social decisions, decisions where we're all better off if we cooperate rather than if we act independently. And she refers to those as social dilemmas. And the quote I particularly love from her is, individuals temporarily caught in a social dilemma have resources to innovate and change the structure itself in order to improve joint outcomes. And I think that that's what cost effectiveness and cost benefit are part of. They are part of changing the structure in an attempt to improve joint outcomes in things like publicly provided health care, environmental regulations, and a great many other decisions. The outline of the talk, I'll give a little bit about the similarities and differences of cost effectiveness and cost benefit analysis. This audience is much more familiar with cost effectiveness analysis, so I hope I have something to tell you about cost benefit analysis that you don't already know. I'll talk a bit about guidelines for both of them, CEA and CBA. That's really, and Elinor Ostrom has changed my perspective on what I do. Part of it, as I now realize guidelines as part of that decision-making structure, part of changing the structure so we get better outcomes. I'll talk then about the CBA techniques for valuing benefits. You're probably all aware that in cost-benefit analysis, all benefits are valued, or at least analysts try to value them in money terms. And I'll talk particularly about the value of a statistical life, which is where the analysts come up with the number that they put on life saving. And then finally, I'll come back and say a little bit about the decision processes that are informed by cost benefit and cost effectiveness analysis. Back to that. what is the structure that these are part of issue again. These are the similarities, and there are a lot of similarities between cost effectiveness and cost benefit analysis. In fact, I teach cost benefit analysis. I've had for the last 5 years, and I start with a couple of cost effectiveness analyses because I think they're better at laying out the structure of decision-making problems than cost benefit analyses often are. And you can get practically to the end before you find a significant difference between the two approaches. They both define alternatives that have to be evaluated. Alternatives or comparators, they have to decide on what's the target population, what time horizon is appropriate for this analysis. They project the costs and effects, and they project them in the natural units. They do that in cost-benefit analysis as well. Over the time horizon, then they value the benefits. It's where how the benefits are valued that is the difference between cost effectiveness and cost-benefit analysis. They discount both of them, they compare alternatives, and they conduct sensitivity analyses. So with the exception of that step, valuing the benefits, they're very, very similar approaches to things. These are the primary differences between them. As you know, cost effectiveness analysis takes a health sector perspective. It looks at health outcomes. It looks at health sector costs. The benefits that it considers are the health outcomes, and these days usually are translated into quality-adjusted life years, which use weights which are based on people's valuations, people's trade-offs of health against time, against probability, but you're trying to find out how the people involved feel about these health states. And then the summary measure, because of course the outcomes, the benefits, health, improved health are measured in different terms from the cost, has to be an incremental cost effectiveness ratio, the cost per quality adjusted life year. The cost benefit analysis tradition tries to take a societal perspective. That means anything, any cost, any benefit in the relevant jurisdiction is fair game for the analysis, and ideally should be included, certainly should be included if it's important. And benefits are anything that people think is a benefit, as long as they're legal. There's an exception now, there's an understanding now in cost benefit analysis that there are certain limits on what we consider as benefits, even in cost benefit analysis, and those benefits are set by the social structure in which the cost benefit analysis takes place. What's legal is part of that structure. What is accepted is part of that structure. When cost benefit analysts try to put these benefits into monetary terms, which they do not because they're particularly fond of money, but because like the cost effectiveness analysis, they want to try to summarize things. It helps decision makers to have a summary. If you give them the full table showing all the costs and all the benefits and say, there you are, make your decision, they pretty quickly become overwhelmed. So it's helpful if you can come up with a summary measure. And the summary measure in cost benefit analysis is based on being able to translate benefits into money terms. And I'll be coming back to that a lot. But those money terms, just like quality weights, are based on the values of the people who are affected by the decisions. They're based on their trade-offs of these benefits against money. And because everything's in money terms, cost-benefit analysis can state the summary measure as net benefit, the dollar quantity of benefits minus the dollar quantity of cost. And of course, you want, ideally, preferably, for the benefits to exceed the cost. That doesn't say you can't make a social decision where that's to do something, even if that's not the case, but in general, you will be making better social decisions if the analysis has been done properly by choosing those things where the benefits exceed the cost. Guidelines are part of this structure building because in both of these traditions, it quickly became apparent that, well, this is a helpful idea, but if everybody's going to go off in different directions and do their analyses in different ways, they don't help us with the fundamental job here, which is to be able to compare decisions. And in order for those to compare choices, in order for those comparisons to be fair, to be valid, we have to make sure that the differences actually reflect real-world differences in the effects and in the costs, and not sort of accidental and arbitrary differences in the way the analysts chose to go about doing their studies. So there has been the development of guidelines in both fields, and I've used the term reference case here to refer to the fact that these guidelines define a standard set of methods, a standard set of assumptions, and even a standard set of way of reporting results with the goal of trying to make decision makers' job easier by making the analyses comparable and more transparent. You're well aware of the TEA guidelines, the ones by THETA, the ones that the first U.S. panel on cost effectiveness in health and medicine put out, the ones that the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence has put out, and the World Health Organization, among others. I mean, this is only a selection of the numbers of guidelines around the world. The World Health Organization has its own guidelines for cost-benefit analyses and cost-effectiveness analyses done for middle and low-income countries. The Gates Foundation is about to launch its guidelines for cost-benefit analyses that are done for its cost-effectiveness and cost-benefit analyses in June. So I wanted to go through a few of these guidelines, now beginning to focus on cost-benefit analysis and establishing some of the principles, and particularly the principle of willingness to pay, which is behind how benefits are monetized in cost-benefit analysis. So the first set of guidelines is the Office of Management and Budget Analysis in the U.S. They were put out in 2003. They're known as Circular A4. And they talk to both TEA and CBA. They point out that they both provide a systematic framework. I went through those similarities, and that shows how they go through the systematic framework. So they're very much alike in that way. They also state what is the societal perspective in practice. It tends to stop at national borders, because your analysis should focus on benefits and costs that accrue to citizens and residents of the United States. And then the principle that has become central to cost-benefit analysis, especially in the last 30, 40 years. How do we value these benefits? Opportunity cost is the appropriate concept. The principle of willingness to pay, WTP for short, captures the notion of opportunity cost by measuring what individuals are willing to forgo to enjoy a particular benefit. Opportunity cost, what are they willing to give up? What are the opportunities they are willing to forego in order to have this benefit instead? That anybody who buys something is making a decision that this is worth more to me than what I could have bought with the money. And it's that basic principle that is behind willingness to pay in the use of cost-benefit analysis. Willingness to pay wasn't always the way benefits were valued, and I'll come back to that later in cost-benefit analysis. So the Office of Management and Budget goes into a bit of detail to explain that the reason it's the proper measure conceptually is it tries to capture everything people value about this. What do they think the benefit of this is? And in terms of valuing health and valuing life, compared to the earlier approaches were to value health or life by looking at the future earnings the person could have earned if their life had been spared, or at the cost of treating them. Those were used as ways of valuing lives. They are no longer, because there's an awful lot they leave out. Clearly, we don't value only the part of our lives we spend working. We value all the rest of them as well. And willingness to pay captures that, or attempts to capture that. Attempts to capture pain and suffering and other quality of life effects, all that other time, all those other things you're doing with your life. The term that's used for the willingness to pay measure for life, or for saving a life, is the value of a statistical life. And it's described here as the monetized value of small changes in fatality risk. Each of us is making decisions every day about what to do. Are we going to jaywalk? Are we going to use our seat belts? Are we going to do this? We're making choices that make a small difference in our risk of health and survival. And that the value of a statistical life is based on that kind of a decision. And later in the talk, I'll be showing you specifically where those numbers come from. They come from mostly from labor market studies. In 2003, and this would have been based on numbers from the 1990s and the early 2000s, the OMB reported that VSL estimates varied from 1 million to 10 million. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency is the agency most affected by these guidelines because it has a lot of major regulations, and it's the major regulations that are required to do cost-benefit analyses. EPA currently uses a VSL, and this is in 2008 dollars, of almost $8 million. A saved life is worth $7.9 million, and of course they adjust it upward for inflation when they use it in later studies. You'll begin to see the size of the field when you see that this estimate comes from, it's the average from, a distribution based on 26 published studies. Most of them were from the US, but some of them were from other countries, about 20 from the US and 6 from other countries. Then, of course, they recognize that there isn't a single number. How much people are willing to pay for saving a life is going to depend on exactly the circumstances in which the life is saved. And they list some of those, but they really don't have any way, they don't yet have the empirical background that allows them to adjust VSLs for these circumstances. The Treasury Board of Canada has its own guidelines for Canadian cost-benefit analyses. And I like the first quote because it just gets in there that there's cost-benefit analysis being done all over the world, and lots of different agencies are supporting it, and lots of different agencies have their own guidelines. And again, they come to the basic principle, willingness to pay. Willingness to pay is what we're looking for here when we value benefits. We want to find a measure of what people are willing to pay because that reflects how they feel about this benefit. Willingness to pay for an incremental unit of a good or service measures its economic value to the demander and hence its economic benefit to the economy. And the Canadian guidelines are based, for VSL, are based on much the same set of studies as the US guidelines. They came up with a 2004 value for VSL of 6.1 million that's used in Canadian cost-benefit analyses. This number, of course, is updated for inflation. Also, if you update it to 2008 to match that one that I just gave from EPA, it's pretty close. It's around $7 million. So they're very similar numbers. The UK Treasury, the Green Book, is another set of guidelines for cost-benefit analysis in the United Kingdom. And it, again, states the societal perspective at the beginning. This is the target population for a cost-benefit analysis. And it notes that willingness to pay is the concept on which the monetizing of benefits is based. And it notes, and it's quite correct, that this is a lower bound. And we can talk about that later if you'd like. Then they get into their particular willingness to pay, which is 1.145 million pounds per fatal casualty. They describe it slightly differently in 2000 prices. And they say, in addition to this willingness to pay, now this is the Department of Transport. And I need to specify that because there seems to be, as I was going through these guidelines, there seems to be a subculture within cost-benefit analysis that, at least in the US and the UK, is focused on departments of transport, and they have a different notion of what the willingness to pay should be, and they add a lot of stuff to it, which other agencies don't do. So what the UK is recommending here is what their Department of Transport does, making very rough adjustments for the exchange rate and for inflation since 2000. That comes up to about $2.5 million in around 2008, 2010. At that time, the Transportation Department in the United States was using $3 million as willingness to pay. So they seem to be very much in agreement on that. And the Department of Transportation in the United States was also adding in other stuff on top. Now I want to get a bit more into the basic thinking behind willingness to pay, a little bit more into that, and then into how it's actually applied. Where do you actually find these numbers? How would you possibly come up with what people are willing to pay for a life saved through, say, an environmental regulation or improving the roads, or something that you would do through a publicly funded health system. Here are two of the basic ideas. They come from Rick Freeman's measurement of environmental and resource values. He's one of the theoretical gurus in the environmental cost-benefit analysis field. There's the basic premise of welfare economics, the basic premises, and this is what willingness to pay is based on, are that the purpose of economic activity is to increase the well-being of the individuals who make up society, and that each individual is the best judge of how well off he or she is. So the idea is that any public decision should be intended to improve the well-being, say, of the people in this room, and the people in this room are the best judges of when their well-being has been improved or not. And where do we get ideas of those, because we can't constantly be bringing everybody in the province or everybody in the state into the room and saying, okay, now tell us how you value this. Where can we get ideas of how people do value things? This is where the monetization comes in. The trade-offs people make as they choose to buy a good or service rather than some other good or service reveal their values. They reveal their willingness to pay. The money price of a market good, the price you pay when you buy something, is a special case of a trade-off ratio. You're showing that you prefer this to what else you could have done with that money. And that's where we start to look for these. In the past, a little history here, I mentioned this earlier, in the past, cost-benefit analysis valued lives principally at the present value of future earnings. That was the main approach, and it was sometimes referred to as human capital or productivity. And it was in the 60s and 70s that some economists, including E.J. Michan and Thomas Schelling, began to argue that this was the wrong way to do it. It was incomplete. It was not reflecting the values of the people involved. By the mid-1980s, they had pretty much persuaded economists that it was the right way, that the previous approaches were wrong, and that the appropriate approach was to look for willingness to pay. And Jones Lee, Michael Jones Lee, who's been involved in this field for many decades, summed it up. The conclusion was that social decisions should reflect the interests, preferences, and attitudes to risk of those who are likely to be affected by the decision. And that in the case of safety, those are best summarized in terms of what people would be willing to pay or would ask in compensation for typically small changes in the probability of death or injury. So we're going to try to look for places where we can figure out how much people are willing to pay either to reduce their risk or to accept a higher risk. And by the 1980s, willingness to pay was accepted as the way to go. Cost-benefit analysis has not used future earnings to value lives saved since at least that time. I mentioned earlier that these measures are based on the values of the people who are actually affected, as they are either revealed through choices people actually make in markets, or the hypothetical choices they make in surveys, much like quality surveys, only here, instead of asking them to trade off states of health against time, for example, you're asking them to trade off risks against money. How much would you be willing to pay to reduce your risk? How much would you accept to increase your risk? And I want to start with an example that is a little bit less central and perhaps easier to accept than valuing a statistical life. I want to start with airport noise, because the same method has been applied a lot there. Where would you look? There's no market for airport noise. Where would you look for a price for airport noise? Well, where economists have looked is at house prices. If people value quiet, then they are going to pay more to live in quieter areas, other things equal. So you would expect that houses in noisy areas would sell for less, and would give you a sense for how people feel about airport noise and what's the money value they put on it. For value of a statistical life, wages. If people value safety, you would expect them to require a higher wage in return for accepting a higher risk, or be willing to accept a lower wage for a safer job. So economists have looked at labor markets. This has been developed into the hedonic pricing method, which is behind, it's the major method, I think it's fair to say, of coming up with willingness to pay values. The idea is that any good of any real good is usually a combination of characteristics, of attributes. It's a bundle of things, and you buy the whole bundle, but you value the attributes in the bundle individually. Your value for the attributes makes up your value for the goods. So if the goods price reflects all its attributes, you can run a regression in which the dependent variable is the price, and the right-hand side variables are the attributes of the good, and the regression coefficient for each of those attributes will tell you how much people are willing to pay for that attribute. If it's a dichotomous attribute, they'll say, I'm willing to pay this much to have, the regression coefficient will show that people are willing to pay this much to have this attribute compared with not having it. If it's a continuous attribute, the regression coefficient will show you how much more they're willing to pay to have one more unit of the attribute. Those regression coefficients in a hedonic pricing regression are called the hedonic or implicit price, buyer's willingness to pay. So the airport noise example. Quiet is the good. Most people prefer quiet, not everybody. Economists have regressed house price on the attributes of the house, the attributes of the neighborhood, and airport noise. You have to control, of course, for everything else if you want to get a correct estimate of the effect of airport noise. You don't want to be leaving out a lot of confounders and coming up with a coefficient that simply reflects the fact that this house has a whole lot of desirable characteristics. You want to isolate the effect of airport noise. And this is an example, actually, that I use in my course. It's an analysis of airport noise in Richmond, BC, British Columbia, where Vancouver's airport is located. It was published in 1993, and by that time, as you'll see in a moment, there was already a lot of literature in this area. It was following the standard literature in taking the natural log of house price. The standard functional form in these regressions is the natural log of price as a function of the attributes on the right-hand side. And it regressed the natural log of house price on a summary of noise, the noise exposure forecast. Airport noise was such a big issue by this time that the Federal Aviation Administration in the United States and its counterpart in Canada had developed summary measures of noise and had contour maps that showed what the levels of noise were around various important airports. So they ran a regression in this analysis of house price on this noise exposure forecast, which is a summary of noise, and 9 characteristics of the house and 3 characteristics of the attributes. And there have been other studies that have, 3 characteristics of the neighborhood, things like, how far to the central business district, how far to the nearest schools. There have been other studies that have even more right-hand side attributes. What's surprising is how consistent the results have been. The first bullet gives you a little bit of a sense for what's a noisy area. Noise exposure forecast is measured in decibels, and less than 25 is quiet, 40 or more is really annoying. The coefficients they got on noise exposure for detached houses was a negative 0.0065. That is, the noisier the area, the lower the house price after controlling for all of these other characteristics. This is a log-lin regression, so that's a proportion. That shows you the proportional change in price. You multiply it by 100, you have the percentage change in price. It means the house price reduces by 0.65% for each decibel increase in airport noise. And a 10 decibel increase reduced house price is 6.5%. The t-statistic is there to show you that the coefficient was statistically significant. The t-statistic was a 4. If you're in clinical sciences, you're more used to z-statistics, but they're exactly the same. It's 4. It's definitely, you can reject the hypothesis that there's no effect here at a high level of confidence. This number was quite consistent, surprisingly consistent, with a review that had been done earlier of 13 studies of airport noise. By 1980, when Nelson published this review, there were already enough studies of this to have a review, and they had found an average of 6.1% reduction, looking at a lot of different airports, a lot of different databases, a lot of different abilities to control for the other attributes. There's a number of requirements, and these probably aren't all of them, for market prices to give you an accurate estimation of willingness to pay. The market has to have a reasonably large number of buyers and sellers so that none of them can manipulate the price. Very good information is important because without very good information, well, let me put it in the positive, buyers need good information in order to be able to decide what their valuation is. If they don't understand the product, and we all know this from trying to get quality weights, if they don't understand the health state, they're not going to be able to tell you how they value it. Well, if they don't understand the product, they're not going to be able to tell you how to value it either. And if sellers don't understand the product, they're not going to get a very good fix on the production cost, and they'll have problems as well. Just to show how important that is, another airport noise study actually found that was lucky enough to use a natural experiment in which an information disclosure law came into effect near the Raleigh-Durham Airport, in part because the Raleigh-Durham Airport Authority took advantage, tried to take advantage of it. They've been sued a couple of times for airport noise, and they had a strong incentive to try to make sure that buyers were well informed. And that study found that you would think airport noise is pretty easy to evaluate. There were various reasons why it might have been a little harder to evaluate in the Raleigh-Durham area, but that study found that after the disclosure law, the penalty, the reduction in house price in the noisiest areas near the airport went up even more. It had been almost 8%, it went up to over 10%. And no externalities. Buyers receive all the benefits, sellers pay all the costs. Now, where does the value of a statistical life come from? I gave you those numbers. Where do those numbers come from? I mentioned it before. If workers value safety, then we should expect to find that safety is an attribute of a job. A job is a collection of things that comes as a bundle. And if workers value safety, we should expect that riskier jobs will pay higher wages after controlling for other things. Well, the value of statistical life that's used by regulatory agencies is based primarily on labor market studies, on this wage-risk trade-off. Viscusi has been a very big name in this field. He's made it his life's work to come up with this kind of analysis. And an influential study of his, published in 2004, is a good example. It was influential, and I'll say this part now. It was influential because for the first time he was calculating risk to a greater level of precision than previous studies. Most previous studies had used industry risk. He calculated risk by industry and occupation. And everybody knows mining is more dangerous than retail. But within mining, there's a big difference between people who work in the head office and people who work in the mines. And within retail, there's a big difference between people who work on the floor of the store and people who work in the loading bay. So he had risk figured out by industry and occupation in order to try to get a better fix on what the wage risk differential was. And again, the typical approach in this, both in the employment and wage literature generally, but in the hedonic literature as well, is to put the dependent variable in natural log form. He regressed the natural log of the hourly wage on the risk of death, which was measured as deaths per 100,000 workers in a year, on the risk of injury to control for that, on the level of workers' compensation replacement to control for that, on a series of worker characteristics, and on a series of dummies for occupational groups, metropolitan area, and region. And you may recognize those dummies for occupational groups as a crude attempt to control for the other things that differ about jobs. You can think of a number of things that differ about jobs and wonder whether perhaps we need to do a still better job of controlling for them. He fitted regressions for all of the workers in his sample. This is the current population survey in the US, for men and women separately, and for blue-collar men and blue-collar women separately. Here's how you get the value of a statistical life out of that. In the sample for all workers, the wage increase for each death per 100,000 workers is equal to the coefficient. Remember, in a log-ln regression, the coefficient is the proportional change in the dependent variable. So it's the proportional change in the wage. The proportional change, the coefficient was this 0.0017. You can see it's positive, which is what you would expect. It was statistically significant. Wages go up with higher risk. Take that 0.0017 times the average wage in 1997, which was the data for this study, and you come out, workers receive in this whole sample a bit more than 2 cents per hour per death to face that risk. Then you multiply that times the number of deaths, or the death rate, which was 4 per 100,000. So you get the full differential, risk differential in that year was almost 10 cents, 9.5 cents an hour. Times 2,000 hours, that's $190 per year per worker to accept risk on the job, the risk of death on the job. That's 100,000 workers receiving $190 a year. So you multiply by $190 by 100,000 workers to avoid these 4 deaths. That comes over to $19 million. It's because it's 4 deaths, you divide by 4. That works out to almost $5 million per statistical life, 4.75 in 1997 dollars, and then of course you have to trend it forward to 2012, about $7 million. So if you don't quite follow that, I hope you'll ask me later, but I wanted to show you exactly how you get from that regression up to those numbers that I was quoting you earlier. And all of the steps are in that slide. There's been some more work. This continues to be a very active field. Viscusi and Kniesner used the panel survey of income dynamics, and again, Viscusi's occupation risk measures in an attempt to try to use all the best techniques to bring the range of the SLs down. Remember in that first slide, the range that the OMB gives based on studies that were done in the 1990s and early 2000s was $1 to $10 million. It's a pretty wide range. And even if you use the average, it makes you a little worried what you've actually got there. So using everything they could think of, the best risk estimates, this panel survey, which allows them to do a better job of controlling for the type of job, and a number of econometric improvements, they came up with what in 2012 dollars is a range of $6 to $14 million for the VSL. In relative terms, that's a considerable reduction. In OMB, it was the highest number was 10 times the lowest number. Here, the highest number is a little bit more than 2 times the lowest number. There's also an issue that I'll skip over, but can come back to if people want, the willingness to pay versus willingness to accept. They addressed that in a separate paper and concluded that despite the argument over that, these estimates are still roughly in the range of $7 million, and that's a pretty solid estimate. Couple more slides on, well, actually I've got a couple more on CBA as well. Another issue that I would just quickly mention is at the same time that Schelling and others were helping people come to the realization that willingness to pay was the right way to value lives, Schelling raised this issue that has been accepted ever since as simply true, that we're willing to pay more for identified lives, people we know who are in danger now, than we are to pay for statistical lives, that is, reducing the risk through some regulation, through some improvement in care, that kind of thing. Well, I argue in this editorial, which is online now and which will be printed in Medical Decision Making in July, that actually he was misled by the fact that at the time, cost-benefit analysis was valuing lives at future earnings. And future earnings, present value future earnings, is a lot less than we're willing to spend on identified lives. But once you start using these VSL estimates, It turns out that the amounts that we're willing to spend on statistical lives look an awful lot like the amounts that we're willing to spend on identified lives. And I go through the case of the rescue of 33 Chilean miners to show the logic of that. A couple of examples, the great value that people are uncomfortable with monetizing these benefits, but the value of monetizing these benefits is it allows a great many different kinds of benefits to be combined into a summary measure. And summary measures can be very useful for decision makers rather than giving them huge tables of all of the if, ands, and buts, and here's everything you could get, and you figure out how much. They can still go back and say, well, never mind the summary measure, we want to see what's behind it, but it can be helpful to have a starting point. EPA did an analysis of the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments, and remember, they do cost-benefit analysis routinely. That's what they're required to do, not cost-effectiveness analysis. Here's a list of the benefits that they were able to value, and they freely granted they weren't able to value every benefit they knew was out there, and they listed some of the others that they couldn't value because of lack of sufficiently good empirical information on the size, first of all, simply the natural magnitude, and then the lack of anything that would allow them to put a money value on it. The benefits they valued from the Clean Air Act were reductions in mortality and illness, improvements in visibility at recreational sites and residential areas, benefits to commercial timber, agricultural crops, recreational fishing, and reduced materials damage. All of that in total benefits. And it turned out that of the things that they were able to monetize, 90% of the benefits were these improvements in mortality and illness. But they did get another 10% from those other items. Benefits exceeded the cost in every year over the horizon of the analysis, and by quite a large margin. By 2020, they estimated benefits of $2 trillion, costs of $65 billion, public and private costs. Another example, a much earlier EPA evaluation of lead in gasoline, which is no longer in gasoline, but it was at the time. They were able to value the cognitive and health benefits to children, because lead in gasoline led to lead in the air, led to lead in children's blood levels, led to cognitive problems. They were able to value the reduction in damage to catalytic converters. They were able to value the reduction in car maintenance, principally leaded gas damaged cars that weren't designed for it, and there were a lot at that point that were not designed for it. They also discovered, too late to put it into the final legal case, so the legal case for reducing lead still further was based on these first three. They discovered this, and it was bigger than any of the first three. Too late to put it in the legal case because the scientific information that showed that lead in gasoline leading to lead in air led to more hypertension had not yet been peer reviewed, and their legal counsel told them you can't put that in the final case. You can put it in there as a supplemental case, but you can't base the reasoning for the regulation on it. I'll just mention, because Murray's drawn my attention to it, this welfarist versus extra welfarist argument, which was really the argument between cost-effectiveness analysis, which doesn't try to take everything into account, and cost-benefit analysis, which does. But I think the important point is whether either one of them will ever become a complete decision-making procedure, I don't know, but neither one of them is a complete decision-making procedure at this point, and they have to be embedded in a larger process. And it's been interesting to me, particularly since Eleanor Ostrom's work and Murray's comments in the second panel have brought my attention more to look at the process in which these are used, to look at all the stuff that I simply took for granted without thinking about it much. And there's a lot of similarities, and some of those similarities are supported by Eleanor Ostrom's work across agencies in how they use them. The EPA evaluations are subject to lots of technical and legal review. They have committees that do this. They have public comment periods. And then, of course, there's oversight by Congress and the possibility of court challenge, which happens a lot. There's the Health Quality Ontario process, which I understand they're still working on, which laid out 4 broad criteria, cost effectiveness being only part of one of them, that we should be thinking about when we try to make these decisions. The NICE Guide to Technology Appraisal you'd think that might be just a guideline, set of guidelines on how to do cost effectiveness analysis. In fact, more than half the document has to do with how are you going to use that cost effectiveness analysis? How is the appraisal committee constituted? Who's on it? What should they consider? At what points and how should they allow clinicians and manufacturers and patients to make their views known? And what social and ethical values has NICE decided should be explicitly considered and maybe given somewhat different weight from other considerations. And then the need for transparency and clarity in explaining the recommendations. All of these things that we kind of, many of us almost say by rote, especially the part about transparency and clarity. And yet it's part of the structure of using these decisions, of using the analyses that we create. So I'd like to come back to Ostrom's comment about how basically all of us here are involved in helping to develop new techniques and new institutions that will help guide collective cooperative choices that lead us to a better solution than we could come to on our own. And cost effectiveness analysis and cost benefit analysis are part of that. When we try to make advances in cost effectiveness analysis and cost benefit analysis, we should be thinking about how can they advance better decisions. And we often are thinking about how can they advance better decisions. Remember the importance of information. Part of what we're doing here is trying to supply the decision makers with the information they need to be able to value these things appropriately and in a way that reflects how the people who are going to be affected would value them. So I'd leave that question with us. How can we think not only about cost effectiveness and cost benefit analysis, but how it fits into this larger structure and what maybe we can be doing as researchers to think about that structure and think about improving it. And then I'll end with the second panel because I guess we're yet another step in thinking about the structure of the decision-making in which cost effectiveness analysis and cost benefit analysis play a part. Thank you.
That was a wonderful talk.
Thank you.
I think I might have missed what that draft was to the right.
This one?
Yes.
Oh, I didn't explain it. That is the number of, that's from the Tufts Cost Effectiveness Analysis Registry. It's the number of cost utility studies published every year since, about 1994, I think.
Can we assume that growth in CBA has been as great?
I think you can, but I don't have a graph to show it.
If someone might believe that different areas were more prone to different types of analyses, do you have a feeling why CBA might not feel as welcome in health?
Well, it is this whole discomfort about saying we're only going to spend so much to save a life here. And ultimately, any decision-making agency that says we're going to do this and not that is making such a decision, but to say so out loud just makes people very uncomfortable. And you knew that already, so I'm not sure.
Well, here's the last follow-up. So my role to say to decision makers in healthcare, look, you might feel uncomfortable, but get used to it. You're either doing this covertly or overtly. Or should my role be, given they don't want to talk about it, I will give them as much information about the thing of which they don't want to talk, but it shall remain nameless.
Well, well, I guess in a lot of cases, we've done the latter, haven't we? The National Institute for Health and Care Excellence is probably the only place where they are just straight out about it. We are going to consider this, and here's what we are going to consider a reasonable range, and here's what we're going to be thinking real hard about. And I think they're right to set a range and to even allow for the possibility that there may be exceptions outside of that range, but they're being much more explicit about it than anybody else. I don't have the answer to your question as to whether we can get people to be more explicit about it. I think I agree with your underlying premise that maybe it would help decision making if they were more explicit about it, but I don't know how to get them to be or make them comfortable with it. Yeah.
That was a great talk. I guess I'm still a little, it's one of the criticisms of the willingness to pay approach to advice life has been this idea that labor markets are really, that people sell their labor in a way that is not constrained. That those that how much people accept for their labor actually reflects how much that they have choices and where they can actually sell their labor, and they can move between jobs, and the unemployment rate is low enough that people actually have those sorts of freedoms. But there really are a lot of constraints in real life in terms of where people can work and what kind of jobs people have. Does that bother you at all in terms of thinking, using that labor market approach to values?
I completely agree with it. Remember, I mentioned earlier that the Treasury, the United Kingdom Treasury, explicitly states it's a lower bound, and it's even a lower bound in countries like the U.S. and Canada where we use $7 million. And it's a lower bound not only for the reasons you said, that there isn't complete freedom to shift around jobs and to say, well, never mind, I'd rather, I would like a living wage, but I don't like this way of getting it, and I don't want to take this job. It's also a lower bound because the people, to the extent that people do have freedom to make choices, people who are less averse to risk will take the risky jobs. And so those of us who wouldn't touch a job like that with a 10-foot pole are not, our values are higher than theirs, just to put it mildly. So yes, they're underestimates. At the same time, you don't need everybody to be free to make a choice in order to get some reasonable sense of what people would do, as long as a fair number of people are free. It's that we're making marginal changes here, and marginal changes in the labor market reveal the valuations of enough people that we can have a sense for how they would value it. Plus, it's a whole lot better than the present value of future earnings. It's just much closer than that ever was to how people value their lives. So, is it perfect? Should anybody be perfectly comfortable with it? But no, but that's part of why it's part of the decision-making process. We were talking about this last night at dinner. I mean, when all those appraisal committees get together in a room and puzzle over this stuff, they're trying to come up with the real utilities and the real social aggregation of those utilities. And they are informed by these imperfect measures, but they don't have to feel bound by them.
Okay. You introduced guideline, CBA. Question is whether they have some guideline of CBA designed for public health or HCA health care.
I'm not sure. You're talking about the guidelines for CBA, and what was the question?
Yes, whether it has some CBA designed for like health care.
Oh, you mean do they ever do cost benefit analysis? Well, EPA is doing an awful lot of stuff in health, but it's not considered a health agency. I guess I would say that in what we think of as the health sector, the clinical sector, there's very little cost benefit analysis, and it's very much around the margin. Although you can turn any cost effectiveness analysis into a cost benefit analysis, even class is tapping on the DSL as the college is likely quality estimated. Within the health sector, it's not used. And yet, agencies like the Environmental Protection Agency that have enormous effects on health do use it.
Some WHO that for public health that we use CBA.
Yes, you're right. Okay. So I think the answer to I'm going a bit beyond my knowledge of what other high-income countries do. I think that in general, in high-income countries, cost-benefit analysis is not used in clinical health. But you're right, WHO does use it. And they use it, I think, in part because there is so obviously and so much of the word I'm looking for. Things don't stay neatly in the clinical sector so much in low-income and middle-income countries. You're looking at the choice between mosquito bed nets and whether you treat this condition in the clinical sector, and whether you improve the water supply. And it's so much more obvious that many of the choices completely ignore the bounds of the clinical health sector, and therefore you need a method that's going to allow you to look at that. And in fact, I teach one example that looks at the effects of trying to reduce indoor air pollution, which comes from burning a fire in your house. And they looked, part of the other reason that they want to use cost-benefit analysis is that many of the most immediate benefits came from the time and the money that was saved on fuel. Even though some of the benefits were expected, particularly in the longer term, to be health benefits were not free in all of that period there. So again, cost-benefit analysis makes it easier for them to consider a range of benefits and a range of interventions that doesn't fit neatly into clinical. You can thank THETA in part because we emailed back and forth, and she said, "Yeah, we'd really be interested to hear about that."
Yeah, trying to think through the and how to think about value of health. I mean, so you say simple, you thought life or death, the number on it, probably cost effectiveness value is part of that. So I guess how, so we don't talk about production, consumption. There's this distinction between the intrinsic value of a life, captured quality, and then the other value of a life. And I'm wondering about your thoughts about how you close number the value of life. Can it be done in intrinsic value and other?
Well, I guess I think the first question is, should we be trying to decompose it that way? Cost-benefit analysis doesn't. In that EPA analysis, for example, one of the Clean Air Act, there was, and I when I was looking through the cost-benefit analysis guidelines, I kept looking for mentions of future earnings, mentions of consumption. They don't appear. It seems that once the field went over to willingness to pay, that just went out.
If you choose a part of that, you've made it.
I don't think that's what we've chosen a part of when we choose QALYs. What we have chosen is not to take the final step of putting a money value on. We could take those QALYs and we could multiply them by $7 million. And that would make it into a cost-benefit analysis. Instead, what we seem to be talking about is counting a lot of effects downstream from the improvements in health or the decrements in health that, as far as I can tell, are no longer being considered in cost-benefit analysis. This analysis looked at what we would call the direct cost of the intervention. What does it pay people to meet these amendments? It didn't go any further than that. It didn't try to work out, it didn't spend a minute worrying about, how much of that willingness to pay reflects what people would be making in future earnings and how much of it should we be deducting consumption from it, because you could still make that argument. That just has gone out the window. It's not there anymore. So I have trouble with the whole idea that we should be trying to decompose into those components at all.
If you're not going to decompose, you think that quality represent, if you represent all of the value of health, and if that means you are throwing away value of health, other values of health, mental value, else is going around and that's where they're at. They're making this clear distinction about health, quality, and the other. And I think those things always that you say all around the bundle. But once you pick out qualities that put in health and you say you want to
I see QALYs as a way of measuring the intrinsic value of health while staying away from the dollars. So I see them as equivalent to the value of a statistical life. They're measuring every effect we have on health. They're not trying to put a money value on it, and they're not worrying about what people do with that health, whether they, you know, go into the paid labor force, whether they go to school, whatever. I'm still looking for the theoretical justification that the members of the second panel who feel that way are going to offer us to make this sound logical to me. But to me, it doesn't sound logical. To me, I see qualities are the equivalent of willingness to pay, but without the dollar sign. And willingness to pay includes everything that people value about health. There isn't anything else that needs to be included. So I don't see anything else that needs to be included in qualities.
I wonder also, for example, I went with very low before cancer disease much higher. Because since separating these numbers might help makers to make objectively. One of the
Well, you saw a hint of that in the United Kingdom's Treasury guidelines, where they said that the health and safety executive doubled the number that we just told you to see the willingness for avoiding a cancer. And the EPA recognizes that the value of the statistical activities are seen under all circumstances. I think there may be two reasons for making this up to some extent. One is it's just very hard to get down to that level of training. Done well to get this, and we're still trying to get a benefit from this average time number. And the other is there are a lot of decisions where average numbers, like the environmental protection agency. People die from different causes as a result of pollution. And as long as we have an average, we're going to be able to cover all of them. Yeah.
Thank you, everybody. Like, we are way over time, so I'd like to conclude the official round for now. Do you have any questions? I'm sure Dr. Russell
Oh,
can around this a little bit.
Sure, I can stay if people would like to ask questions.
I'd like to thank Louise.
Thank you.
Coming all the way, giving fantastic round. Thank you very much. That's for you. Oh, thank you, everybody. And please fill in the evaluation forms before you run out.